Campfires on the beach are a memorable and long-celebrated tradition of a Cape Cod summer. First Encounter Beach is one of the best places to see the sunset over the water on the Cape. This year, we are unable to gather together for such an event, but are still able to celebrate this tradition through selected stories and speakers commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first encounter between the Nauset people and the English who ventured to this beach on December 8, 1620. In search of a place to settle. 400 years later, those of us on Cape Cod still face many of the same issues. What is it like to be an immigrant here? How do the native people feel about our presence? How have humans impacted this area in 400 years, and how has the landscape changed? Please join us this summer as we explore these issues and the lore of Eastham over the years since this first encounter. You can find these campfire programs on the Eastham 400 website, posted every Sunday night in July and August. Thank you.
In April of 1644, 7 families, which included 49 individual members, left Plymouth to establish an English settlement on Cape Cod. This was nearly half of the citizenry of Plymouth. The heads of household were Thomas Prence, John Doane, Nicholas Snow, Josiah Cooke, Richard Higgins, John Smalley, and Edward Bangs. In this video, you, the audience, will be introduced to each family group by a present-day descendant. The first family we'll hear about is the Prence family. Here is their family tree. This section of the Prence pear tree resides in the 1869 Schoolhouse Museum.
My name is Debbie Abbott, and I've resided in Eastham for 36 years. Thanks to genealogy study done by both my grandmothers, I have known for many years that I'm a direct descendant of 4 Mayflower passengers. However, it wasn't until 3 weeks ago, in this room, that I learned I have a relationship to Thomas Prence, who headed one of the 7 founding families of Eastham. My connection started with William Brewster, an educated man who was the only pilgrim with any political and diplomatic experience. He was often referred to as Elder Brewster because of his involvement with the church in England and in Holland. He was one of the prime movers in the decision to sail for North America and served as the first religious leader of the Plymouth colony and as an advisor to Governor William Bradford. He was the foresigner of the Mayflower Compact. What happened was, 3 weeks ago, I saw this family tree for Thomas Prence. And I looked down and realized that his first wife was Patience Brewster. And I go, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. I know Patience Brewster. She's on my family tree. A friend of my grandmother's did this and gave this to us many years ago. And on the back, it has the genealogy from Brewster all the way down to us. And there is Patience Brewster. Thomas Prence arrived in Plymouth on the ship the Fortune in 1621. He was single, he was 22, and in 1624 he married William Brewster's daughter Patience, who is my 9th great-grandmother. They had 4 children, the youngest daughter being called Mercy Prence, who was born up in Plymouth in 1631. Mercy was a granddaughter and my 11th generation relative to William Brewster. Unfortunately, Patience died in an outbreak of pestilent fever, probably smallpox or influenza, that ravaged both the Indians and the English around Plymouth in 1634. Prence was a much admired addition to the Plymouth colony and quickly became very active in civic affairs, being appointed as an assistant to the governor. I borrow a lot of information from Ron Peterson's excellent newspaper column about Prence that was published in February. Ron is chairman of the Orleans Historical Commission and is writing a series of articles for what's called Plymouth 400, the Nauset Connection. Prence had served in the late 1620s with a group of influential business leaders charged with the responsibility of stabilizing the colony's debt with its financial backers in London. To demonstrate in what high esteem he was held at such a young age, Prence was the only one of the Pilgrim Fathers, who had not arrived on the Mayflower. He served 2 one-year terms as governor of Plymouth Colony, covering for Governor William Bradford in 1634 and 1638. He was the prime mover in creating a settlement here in Nauset and started promoting the idea in 1643. He led the exploratory committee that decided there was not enough room here to move the whole colony down from Plymouth. Therefore, they decided 7 families, a total of 49 persons, would establish the settlement known as Nauset in 1644, with Prence as its leader. Ian Saxene writes about it in The Story of the First Encounter at Nauset. Ian's book was commissioned for the Eastham 400 commemoration by the Eastham Public Library, thanks to a Mass Humanities grant. And Ian writes, as the only town outside of Plymouth founded by the separatists, Eastham was exceptional. But for the surviving oldcomers among the Plymouth Church, the town's founding in 1644 represented a failure. The separatists in Plymouth had intended to form an intentional community, in this case one in which they could nurture a true church, maintaining the bonds of godly association and discipline. They had already failed to attract enough fellow separatists to dominate the colony. The foundation of Eastham represented a major setback in their struggle to keep the church together. At the time, William Bradford lamented the straightness and barrenness of the land around Plymouth, prompting numerous residents to seek greener pastures elsewhere. The Plymouth congregation, led by Bradford and Thomas Prence, thought Nauset a promising spot. After purchasing land from the Nauset Indians, they realized it would not support the whole colony. 7 families who had made land purchases decided to go anyway. They're all names we are familiar with: Prence, Doane, Snow, Cooke, Higgins, Smalley, and Bangs. They became the founders of what was renamed Eastham in 1651. Ron Peterson writes, the settlers found the land at Nauset to be fertile, and the town prospered under Prence's guidance. In addition to his role at Nauset, he was one of the most consequential leaders of Plymouth Colony until his death in 1673. In 1657, Governor Bradford died, and this event would have a profound impact on Prence's life. Bradford had been the colony's indispensable leader since the settlement of Plymouth in 1620, and his loss was enormous. To fill the void, the voters of Plymouth turned to Thomas Prence. He was unanimously elected and held the post for the next 16 years, standing for election each year. After the election in 1657, it was expected that Prence would return to Plymouth from Eastham and assume his duties as the law required. However, Prence was very attached to Eastham, the town he was largely responsible for creating and helping to succeed. He petitioned the General Court and was granted permission to govern from Eastham. This continued until 1665, when he was required to relocate to Plymouth, where the court provided him with a farm. This is a picture of what Thomas Prence's house looked like. It's a pre-1880 photo, and it's on the east side of present-day Route 6. And this is a map that was prepared in 1934 for the Library of Congress, which actually shows very clearly what is existing now. Route 6, known as King's Highway, goes off straight ahead, and going off is what's now known as Governor Prence Road, and there is his house sitting right between them. And another interesting photo is, this is part of a Library of Congress Historic American Building Survey. These are elevations that were done, reconstructed from old photos, measurements of the cellar hole, and recollections from neighbors of this house back in the 1880s. And the original stone, which was the entrance to this house after the house was torn down, somehow made its way to Provincetown, because it is on the floor in the entrance to the Pilgrim Monument. One of Prence's legacies was his commitment to public education. Under his leadership, a law was passed requiring all towns of 50 families or more to maintain a teacher of reading and writing, and all larger towns had to establish a grammar school. Meanwhile, my 8th great-grandmother, his daughter Mercy Prence, married Major John Freeman here in Eastham in 1649. Freeman, who was commissioned a major during the Indian Wars, served Eastham as a highway surveyor, a selectman, a deputy, and an assistant to the governor. They had 11 children together. Both Mercy, who died at age 80 in 1711, and her husband John, who died at age 98 in 1719, are buried together here in Eastham in the Cove Burying Ground on Route 6. Here is a photo of Mercy Prence Freeman's gravestone. It's of interest for several reasons. Many of the original slate stones at Cove Burying Ground display winged skulls and winged heads. This one has a head and wings coming off the side. Mercy's stone also has a heart-shaped inscription area and some very nice ornate border. This stone, her stone, is the oldest original gravestone displaying a winged head in any cemetery on Cape Cod. In closing, I'd like to say that participating in this project has greatly enhanced my family's knowledge about our roots, and for that, I'm very thankful.
Next, we'll hear about the Doane family.
Hello, I'm Deborah Ullman. I grew up mostly in Eastham on Kingsbury Beach Road on Great Pond, and I'm very grateful for these conversations that Deborah DeJonker-Berry and Tom Ryan and Joanna Hollick and Jim Russo helped make happen despite the COVID-19. These conversations are so interesting. And I'm going to talk today about one of the 5 founding families of Eastham that I'm descended from. I picked the Doanes, partly because I grew up climbing on Doane Rock, and I love Doane Rock, and also because the wife of my dad's second cousin, Phil Schwint, who used to do a column in the Cape Codder called a Phil Schwint Blows No Good. His wife, Helen Schwint, did wonderful research back in the 30s, and they resulted in both anecdotes and an elaborate family tree, which helped me identify the 5 families of the founders that I'm descended from. So I'll talk about the Doanes because Deacon John Doane was one of the founders, and he fathered John Doane Jr., who married Edward Bang's daughter, Hannah Edward Bangs, another founder. So Hannah Bangs married John Doane Jr., and Samuel Doane was their kid, who was grandfather of another John Doane, who married Betsy Snow, and their daughter, Abigail Doane, married someone named Henry Young Hatch. That was 1795. And their son was Freeman Doane Hatch, who was grandfather of my great-grandfather, Freeman Cobb Hatch. He was also, let's see if I have this part right, I think my great-grandfather, Freeman Cobb Hatch, was nephew to the famous Freeman Hatch who sailed the Northern Lights clipper ship and won the all-time record for getting from the West Coast, San Francisco, I believe, around Cape Horn at the tip of South America and to Boston. I think he had gotten word that his wife was due, Lydia, and so he was in an all-fire hurry and won the all-time record. Of course, there weren't too many clipper ships sailing around after that time. This was in the late 1800s. But that brings me to the Hatches, whom my dad, who was quite a storyteller, spun lots of tales about the Hatches. One which connects with First Encounter Beach is that this great-grandfather, Freeman Cobb Hatch, he was a very successful potato broker up in Maine and coming back and forth to Boston. And he retired early, I think, to Eastham and owned all of the property on what was then called West Shore Road, which became Samoset Road. So this side, that side of Great Pond, he owned it all. And his brother owned some property down by First Encounter. So they were walking down there one day. They climbed up the hill just north of where the beach is now, and they spotted a rowboat on the shore. And they both spotted it at the same time. So my great-grandfather said, okay, I guess we're going to have to split ownership of the boat. And his brother said, but you've got a lot of boats, Freeman. And he said, yeah, but if you want the boat, you're going to have to share it with me because we spotted it at the same time. And so what he did was he made a deal so that his brother traded him several acres along First Encounter Beach for his other half share of the rowboat. That's a story I heard. That would have been 20th century hatch lore, very early 20th century hatch lore. The reason that these stories, I think, matter so much to me right now is that in this dicey and tragic time of COVID-19 pandemic, we are commemorating 400 years ago when the Mayflower English managed to find a harbor to land on because of another epidemic wiping out the native people. So there's a piece of this whole commemoration process that really calls for some grieving, some recognizing that there were ways that the founders of Eastham actually co-lived with the local Nausets for much of the 17th century without trouble. There were many villages of English getting started around Massachusetts in those years, and there were troubles between the indigenous people, whether Wampanoags or Massachusetts or others, and that was not so much the case on the Outer Cape. There was a recognition by these founding families that they needed to learn how to live here. So it's an inspiration, really, to recognize how much in these times, both of divisiveness, but also of environmental crises, to start telling ourselves the stories that aren't about dominating nature and aren't about white supremacy over diverse peoples, and are instead the stories about our interdependence with nature and our interdependence and benefits gleaned from recognizing our interdependence with the very many different people among us, especially the people whose land we have flourished on and who have not flourished through how they've been treated in those 400 years. The people who lived here have suffered the consequences of a supremacist attitude and a lot of competitive behavior rather than benefiting on the interdependence. So that's what has me so both grateful to learn more and more about these stories from the 1600s and those founding families, but also to puzzle about things like we hear there were all these servants on the Mayflower. Who were the servants, and did any of the families who founded Eastham bring servants with them, or had they all been become free people in the interim years? So that's just one question. So many. Thank you so much.
Next, we'll hear about the Snow family.
Well, we have reached the Snow family, one of the founding families for Nauset Eastham, coming from the English side, from those that were arriving in Plymouth over the previous decades. And the Snow family took up residence in the southern part of Nauset, later to be called Eastham, later to become Orleans. So I'm joined now by Bonnie Snow and her husband Stanley Snow. I'll start with you, Stanley. Have you lived here all your life?
All but 7 years of it.
All right, well, tell us where you went for those 7 years.
Well, I worked on private yachts in Florida and up and down the East Coast. I spent 4 years in the Air Force. I was working on Air Force crash boats, chasing balloons, believe it or not. And I spent 2.5 years in Panama Canal Zone.
Oh, this would have been during the Korean War period, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Well,
1952, or November of 1952 to the end of 58.
and so I imagine most of your life you've been associated with the Snow's store in Orleans, is that right?
Yeah, I put a good part of my life into there. I worked there for 60-odd years. So.
And your kids are running the store now, is that?
Yes, between my brother, Bob, and Bill, who are both still alive. Unfortunately, they're not in to any of this. It's been a great life.
Good.
And
well, this is
loved every minute of it.
This is one of the important parts when talking about the founding families, to know the families are still alive and thriving here in this neighborhood. Bonnie, have you lived here all your life?
I grew up in Chatham, and I went to the Northfield schools for my high school years up in Northfield, Mass. And then I went to Children's Hospital School of Nursing, and I was there when they did the first open heart surgery at Children's. And then when we had our first grandchild, guess what? She had to have open heart surgery.
Oh, my gosh.
But she's fine,
Yeah.
and she's in her late 20s, 30s now, so she's doing well.
So you were there in the 1950s at the
That's
time
right.
of the first
Yeah.
one.
And I got there when they had the polio epidemic of the fall of 58, so that was quite the time.
Yes, for those of us who were alive at the time, it was
Yeah.
in a way like this pandemic that it worried
Yes.
us all sick, especially
Yes,
parents,
but
right?
we had to learn respirators,
Yeah.
and they were great big awkward things, and it was
Yeah.
very difficult.
So you left Boston, the Children's Hospital, and moved back to Cape Cod, is that right?
That's right, and my mother was a practical nurse. She grew up in Eastham. She was born and grew up in Eastham, and married my father. My father was William McGregor, and he was from Dundee, Scotland. And he worked for the Ford garage until the war came, and he couldn't sell cars. There weren't any to sell. And he went to Andover, Mass, and lived with his sister and in-laws. And he worked in his brother-in-law's bowling alley. So for part of the war, I was in Andover, and I spent a lot of time in a bowling alley because my father would take care of me. My mother was working in a factory.
So that's World War II.
That's
so
World
you were
War
quite
II.
young at the time.
Yeah.
Up there.
Yeah.
Now, so you met each other at some point in the 1950s, is that right?
In
Can
Tommy
you tell us how you met? Or
Go ahead.
Well, I had a friend, Tommy Dill, and he lived in Eastham, right next to Town Hall, practically. His father had Ocean View Garage. Tommy's still alive. Not very good health, unfortunately. He was kind of a Yankee trader, and he had just acquired a new boat, so he wanted me to come down and see it. So I drove down, and Bonnie, unfortunately, was on vacation, and her mother was taking care of Tommy's grandmother, Lily Dill, and well, she can tell you what happened about it. She saw us go into the garage, and she said, well, there's somebody to talk to, so she came out, but Tommy and I were looking at the boat, so we didn't show much interest.
so you were looking at the boats, and Bonnie was looking at you. Is that how it went?
So we eventually, we went on a picnic
To
together.
Doane
so,
Rock.
Yeah.
Out of Doane Rock, another famous family.
Yeah.
And Tommy had a real sexy girlfriend who
Yeah.
was 16, and I
Wow.
was in my early 20s, I guess, at the time. And we went to Doane Rock for a picnic, and it's been a picnic ever since.
Wow, isn't that wonderful, Bonnie?
You notice
And-
I let her say that.
Yeah. So you were married in 1959. Is that right? Is that what I
Yes.
understand? And so you've been married for 61 years, if I
That's
know my
right.
arithmetic.
That's right.
Wonderful. Now, during this little segment, we wanted to get to know you a little, and I'm so happy that you've been happy in your lives together.
have been,
It's been a
very.
picnic. It's beautiful of you to say that. Now, we have some pictures we're going to show people.
Okay.
We're going to show people a picture, first of all, of a float in a parade.
Mm-hmm.
This was, I believe, in 1951. There was a parade.
That's correct.
Do you know anything? Let's see. Where would you would have been in the military or
I
getting out of
was
school?
I was on a yacht in Florida
Yeah.
at that point, but it's my brother Bill and his wife Ann are on that float.
Yeah.
Playing constant.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we can see them there in that image on our screen.
That's right.
And
yeah.
1951 would have been, well, for Eastham, it was the year that it got the
300.
name Eastham and its incorporation as a name
That's
of Eastham.
correct.
in
Yeah, 300th
1951.
anniversary of the
And
founding.
Yep. And it was certainly enough after World War II that people were probably ready to have a party at that point. So that's a great picture of the parade. We also have an image we're showing people now of Isaac Snow, one of your ancestors, and another photograph of his brother. And these are the men who were alive at the time that Orleans was founded, when it broke away from, so to speak, or separated from, broke away sounds too harsh, separated from Eastham. So your brothers were connected to, your ancestors rather, who were brothers, were connected to the naming of the new town, I understand.
It's said that Isaac Snow wouldn't have the town named after any town in England.
Yeah.
And so that's why supposedly there was the Duke of Orleans. There's all kinds of stories on how they determined the name of Orleans. But supposedly the Duke of Orleans was traveling in the United States at the time, and he had helped Washington out in the Revolutionary War. The
Right.
French had, so they picked Orleans as
And so it
being
was
the
only
town
less
of
than-
Orleans. That's when Orleans
good.
separated from Eastham.
And it was only 2 decades or less since the Revolutionary War, so we weren't very happy with England at the moment.
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, listen, thanks very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear about the Cookes.
So we have reached the portion of our program about the Cooke family, one of the 7 first families from England moving to this region. We were unable to find a Cooke descendant available to us on the notice that we had. If you are a Cooke descendant and would like to tell us that you're around, we'd love to know that, because in our ongoing project of exploring our history, there'll be ample opportunity in the future to interview you or to speak about the Cooke family. So, what I'd like to do is use this occasion of the Cooke family time segment to speak to us in general about the movement of the 7 families, the Cookes and 6 other families. In 1644, several hundred people, mostly strangers, had already left Plymouth to settle elsewhere. The congregation of the New Plymouth Church itself held many meetings to decide what to do. Should they move the entire colony or the entire city town of Plymouth to some other fit place for their better strength and subsistence? The majority of members at first agreed and then later disagreed. So in this division of opinion, it ended up that 7 households moved to found a new town in the Outer Cape here, the town of Nauset. 7 leading members of the congregation were resolved to resettle in Nauset. These Nauset 7 were the ones that we see on this program. The total men, women, and children in the 7 families numbered 49. The Nauset 7 created the only Cape Cod town to come directly out of the bowels of the New Plymouth Church. Thus, Bradford later wrote, was this poor church left, like an ancient mother grown old and forsaken by her children, not in their affections yet in regards of their bodily presence and personal helpfulness, her ancient members being most of them worn away by death, and those of later time being like children translated into other families, and she like a widow left only to trust in God. Thus, she that had made many rich, herself became poor. That's the words from Bradford. The land of the Nauset 7 that they moved to was a good-sized tract that the Pilgrim Old Comers had reserved for themselves on the Lower Cape. The tract was from sea to sea, across the neck of land, from Namskakit to Billingsgate. Namskakit being where Brewster is, and Billingsgate being Wellfleet. And these are, I was quoting from Russell Jalbert's beautiful book, Where Sea and History Meet, which was prepared for the bicentennial of the daughter town of Orleans that split from Eastham in 1797. So it's important to speak about how they came here, that it was a division in the community at Plymouth. And so when 49 came here, that was about half of those who lived in Plymouth at that time. And so it's no wonder that Bradford wrote about how sorry they were as the mother town to lose half, mostly the young, from their community. This is what happened in 1645 as part of that movement. Under the date of March 3rd, 1645, this is a quotation, the court doth grant unto the church of New Plymouth, or those that go to dwell at Nauset, all that tract of land lying between sea and sea, from the purchaser's bounds at Namskakit to the old Herring Brook at Billingsgate, with the said Herring Brook and all the meadows on both sides of the said brook, with the great bass pond there and all the meadows and islands lying within the same tract. So, with whatever justice or right they had, the Plymouth court gave this group, half of Plymouth, moving to another New Plymouth on the Outer Cape, all of that land. The next important record in the Plymouth court is June 2nd, 1646, and the short quote is, Nauset is granted to be a township and to have all the privileges of a township as other towns within this government have. So that's the Act of Incorporation, 1646, and the name was Nauset. The next reference in the Plymouth Court, the General Court of Plymouth, is from June 7th, 1651. It is ordered that the town of Nauset be henceforth called and known by the name of Eastham. And so despite the fact that we see on signs everywhere the Massachusetts sign at the border of the town incorporated 1651, in fact the town was incorporated in 1646 by the name of Nauset. And in 1651 there was no other act of incorporation, simply a change of names. So that's some background to the place to which these 7 families moved. One has to recognize, I think, 2 parts of this. These families, these 7 families, which would be 14 adults, husbands and wives, and by my close arithmetic, that would be 35 children. that's a lot of children, moved the 49 of them into the middle of about 1,000 Nauset people. And what kind of life would that have been, especially because they decided not to have a town center like Plymouth, but instead to live apart, each on their own 200 acres. People now say, why doesn't Eastham have a town center? It's because they chose at the very, very start not. Instead, to each be on their own 200 acres in the midst of the 1,000 Nauset. So that's some background, and I thank the Cookes for allowing us that time to explore the background.
Next, we'll hear about the Smalley family. John Smalley was born in Devonshire, England in 1613. He came to America in 1632 on the ship William and Francis. A tailor by trade, he married Anne Walden 6 years later in Plymouth. Here is his family tree. He was elected freeman in 1641 by the General Court. He was debt-free, not indentured. He was a landowner and a member of the church, and this last fact was very important, as you will find as we go forward. So he was a freeman. He was in the upper class of the society there. And after moving to Nauset in 1644, he held various offices, constable and surveyor of highways. There was really nothing remarkable about his life, or so we thought, until when he was around 50 years old, he left the Cape for Rhode Island. Why did he leave? Well, in investigating, we found 3 clues as to why he might have exited. First, he was possibly investigated because a child of 5 to 6 years old under his care was found frozen in the snow outside of his home. We don't know what happened forward because in the record it doesn't give specifics, but we do know that this happened, and it must have had some bearing on his wife Anne, perhaps, who he married, as a younger man in Plymouth. It's amazing, though, to think what that might have resulted in. You can just imagine it. Did it make him want to leave? We don't know. Secondly, he met with a man named Edward Fitz-Randolph, who was promoting a resettlement in New Jersey. We know that Fitz-Randolph was on the Cape, but we don't know how they met. I'm going to read a little bit about him, and this is from the biography of Edward Fitz-Randolph by Florence S. Whitehead. Edward Fitz-Randolph was baptized 5 July 1607 in Nottinghamshire, England. Fitz-Randolph and his widowed mother came to America in 1630 in the Winthrop fleet, settling first in Scituate, Massachusetts. He was a yeoman and does not appear to have held any public office. And I'll pause here for a moment. A yeoman was in kind of where it was just the lower rung below freeman in the society. He moved his family to Barnstable in 1639, where he was a juryman in 1641, and his name appears on the list of those able to bear arms in that year. In 1669, Edward sold his Massachusetts property and moved most of his family to Piscataway, New Jersey, because, and this is a quote, New England patriotism and religion were too restrictive. So this gives us a clue as to what the motivations might have been, I think, for our friend, Mr. Smalley, to have left. Third, like Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, he may have veered from the Puritan ideal and became a Baptist. And this was really quite heretical then, and if you did practice this faith and were discovered, you were asked to leave the colony. Baptists believed in the baptism of believers, not infant baptism, and by full immersion in the water once baptized, and a separation of church and state. And finally, you could have a personal relationship with the Creator without the benefit of a minister or someone to intercede in your behalf. Whatever the reason, John Smalley soon moved on from Rhode Island, and maybe he even knew Roger Williams there, to Piscataway in New Jersey. Whatever the reason, John Smalley did not stay in Rhode Island, and he moved on to a settlement in Piscataway, New Jersey. This settlement was very interesting. It was first put together by John Martin, Charles Gilman, Hugh Dunn, and Hopewell Hull, and they were all from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They had received a grant of 40,000 acres at the price of 30 pounds in December 18th of 1666. They had bought this land from the Lenape people. 26 families came, including the Smalleys, and a few years later, the Higgins followed. So 2 families from Eastham. There's a 325th anniversary plaque that can be found in Piscataway, and it's in memory of the Piscataway pioneers, who were it was actually a Baptist settlement. All the children followed their parents or came with them, including their daughter Mary, who was married to John Snow. Yes, there is a Snow connection in this family. They came and didn't stay. They went as far as Rhode Island and on up to Piscataway, but John Snow, for some reason, decided to come back to the Cape, and he ended his days there. Mary was one of twins, so she was bidding farewell to her twin Isaac when they left. John died in 1676 and is buried in Camp Kilmer Cemetery in the Smalley Cemetery plot. I hope you've enjoyed learning more about our friend John Smalley and his family, and hopefully we've asked some questions that you can also ask and maybe discover more information on if you'd like. Next, we'll hear about the Higgins family. Here is their family tree.
In this wonderful program, we've reached the Higgins family, another one of the 7 families that moved here in the mid-1640s from Plymouth. And Plymouth was getting tired. They felt that the ground wasn't fertile enough, it wasn't producing enough crops, it was getting a little crowded. And so several of the families felt the need to move, and 7 of them came here and founded the town of Nauset, which was incorporated in 1646. It changed name to Eastham in 1651, and then Orleans, which is part of our story in this segment, separated off, the southern portion separated off in the late 1700s, not long after the Revolutionary War. I'm joined by Kevin Higgins. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Tom.
Kevin has lived in Orleans essentially all his life, but he'll tell us a little detail about that, and served in the Orleans police force for 34 years and retired recently at the rank of lieutenant. So welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
Tell us something about yourself, please, Kevin.
Well, I can't say that I was born here in Orleans or on the Cape, but I did live here all my life. My father and his 4 brothers were all born in the Orleans area, and my dad, who was born over on Barley Neck in Orleans, ultimately went to the Stockbridge School of Agriculture and essentially got a job at that point working at the Northampton State Hospital, where he met my mom, Eleanor Rogers. I was born at Northampton at the time my mom was working at the Northampton State Hospital, and that same year my parents retired and we moved back here, back to the homestead in Orleans in 1961.
So by the time you were school age, you were here in Orleans and attended schools locally here?
Correct. I went through the Nauset Regional School System, graduating in 1979.
When did I'm curious, I don't know that everybody here knows, when did the Nauset schools region start as the towns together cooperating on this?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I want to say that was about the time that the high school in Eastham actually had been completed, which would have been 1975, 74, 75. They were separating the Orleans, the middle school, Nauset Regional Middle School was actually hosting the high school students while the school was being finished. And I think that was around the early 70s when the regionalization began.
Okay. So we always in these segments like to know something about how the family is today. So we're glad that you're here representing the family. We know that you're the product of the local educational system and have worked here all of your life, for which we're very grateful. So tell us something about, what do you know about your great-great-great-grandparents, the 1640s, Mr. and Mrs. Higgins? What do you know about the woman, for example, Mrs. Rogers, I think your name was?
Correct. In my mom's side of the family, the Rogers, there was Thomas and Joseph Rogers who came over on the Mayflower. Thomas was the dad, Joseph was the son. He was 12 years old at the crossing. Joseph eventually became the lieutenant on the militia here in Eastham, and began working at that time here in town. The interesting part is that we're direct descendants of Richard Higgins as well. So it's almost a dual control. My mom's side came over on the Mayflower, my dad's side came over on the Anne.
I introduced the topic a little imprecisely. It was on the Rogers side that we had the two boys came, the two brothers, Rogers brothers came.
Well, it was. I'm sorry, I misspoke a little earlier. That was actually a father and son, Thomas and Joseph. Okay. Joseph was 12 years old at the time.
I see. And one of them died during that first winter. Must have been the father, probably.
I believe it was. It was 1621.
Yeah. So then the son eventually moved here to this area and became part of the militia and was
correct. He
an
settled
important
here in
part of the citizenry at the time. This would have been well before the Revolutionary War, of course, during the colonial period. And when you're, I understand that you have some documents they're telling you. So what do they say about both sides of your ancestry there?
Well, the documents that I have are actually are some notes that were written by my grandmother back in either the 40s or the 50s, and they're rather interesting because some of the names are obviously they're the old names for Orleans, Eastham. I've got the Rogers, the Mayos, Crosbys, and on this document she indicates that Thomas and Joseph came over from the Mayflower, and I have it broken down all the way down to where I am aware of Lucinda and Zabina Higgins, which were my great-grandparents. Lucinda and Zabina were my great-grandparents. And then my grandfather was Fred Severs Higgins, who married Agatha Shackley, and then my father and my uncles at that point. And that was back at the turn of the century, my dad was born in 1912. He was the oldest. And my Uncle Jack was born in 1921. Uncle Jack, interestingly enough, they were all involved in World War II, and my Uncle Jack, Joseph Higgins, was in the Marine Corps. He was wounded on Iwo Jima in 1945, and he was back stateside at the time recuperating when the town of Orleans became incorporated as a police department, and he subsequently became the first police officer in Orleans.
We're going to look at two images that we have here for you. One of them is, actually they're both from Cove Burying Ground, which is in the sort of the southern part of Eastham, and it was active for burials. It was a one unified town. And one of them is a monument, which you can see now, of a monument to the whole Higgins family. And it's well worded, and I'll let you look at it there, and you can see the honor that we try to pay to our original families from the English side. And the honor we also pay to our Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years before that.
Absolutely.
The other image you'll see now is the burial stone, the headstone rather, for a woman by the name of Thankful Higgins. She must have been, what, the daughter or granddaughter of, is her name on your list there?
I'm sure it's in this flow chart, for lack of a better term. The handwriting is rather difficult to follow, but I do have Thankful Higgins on this document.
You'll notice from this image we're looking at that it's quite clear. The wording, the acid rain has not worn down the wording. The inscriptions on the stone are quite legible. And you'll see beautiful iconography, a beautiful artwork of the angel heads there on that stone. One of the good reasons to visit Cove Burying Ground and catch up with some of this history of the 7 first families. So any ending words you'd like to say? What does it feel like to be part of an historic family?
Well, I feel very humbled to be part of that original family. You always hear about people saying that they came over on the Mayflower, their family came over on the Mayflower, and I can honestly say both sides of my family came over on the Mayflower. And to be able to grow up in this town and be part of this town, and ultimately to be able to give back to this town is very much a humbling experience for me. And I wish that that more people that could have that vested interest in the town itself. But I'm very happy. I'm very thankful that I'm part of it.
I was not born here, but I've spent many years, happy years here, and I've crossed paths with you and with others from these families, and I'm very honored to have met you over the years and in your good work. Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it.
Next, we'll hear about the Bangs family. Here is their family tree.
So we have reached the portion of our program, the Bangs family. Because we don't have with us a representative from the Bangs family with that name, Bangs, but we do have a representative from the family heritage-wise, Debbie Ullman. So, Debbie Ullman, could you speak to us about womaning out?
Well, the thing is that as soon as a woman married a man, and still true, of course, but largely entirely true back then, she would leave her maiden name. That's what we called it, maiden name, behind. So I can say I'm descended from the Bangs, from the Doanes, from the Higginses, from the Prences and the Snows, but, I can't prove it because my name is Ullman. So womaning out is a phrase I learned early. It simply meant that my connections to both the Mayflower and to the founding families of Eastham did not involve my carrying on those family names. That's what womaning out means.
Okay, thank you. It has happened all too often in our society with the way we have done the names in the past, at least.
Yeah,
now,
less so now.
So that's in reference to recognize that Debbie is from the Bangs, or in the Bangs family tree. Mm-hmm. Now, there was a recent, we try to cover some of the history of each family. In this case, there's a little piece of history from just over a century ago about one of the Bangs. Could you tell us about this episode?
Oh, yes. This is a wonderful story I found in the current issue, or the late July issue of the Provincetown Independent. And it's the story about Rosilla Rich Bangs, who was just going about her business as an 85-year-old widow down at the bottom of High Pole Hill in Provincetown when the Pilgrim Monument was being built. Now, one of the bragging things you hear is that no construction workers were injured or killed during the building of that monument, which is quite a remarkable feat. However, on the near the end of the building process, in August 5th, 1908, one of the motorized cars that was used in the construction process was left empty on a level area atop the hill, and it was set in motion by a lightning strike that loosened its tether. Now, the Boston Herald disputed that as the reason, so that's lost to history. However, the runaway car did gain velocity as it rolled down the hill, and it went right through a timber barrier and crashed into the poor Rosilla Rich Bangs, who died on the spot. She was married to a Solomon Bangs, and there is an obelisk in the cemetery in Provincetown. We think this is why we can't find any Bangses in Eastham, because they went on out to the tip of the Cape. And the obelisk has 3 generations buried in that plot of Bangs. So they have been here. Of course, there's also Bangs Street. I rented actually a summer apartment one summer many years ago on Bangs Street. And what's your Bangs story, Tom?
Well, my Bangs story, if you look on the screen right now, folks, you'll see a communion cup, a silver chalice. And the inscription on the front of it, which you might be able to make out, is Ex Dono, E-X-D-O-N-O, a gift of Mr. Joshua and Mrs. Hannah Bangs to the Church of Eastham, 1700. This work of silver from 1700 that was purchased by Mr. Bangs, was made in Boston by Jeremiah Drummer, who was a silversmith who was a mentor to the young Paul Revere, as a matter of fact, in Boston's North End. And Jeremiah Drummer's work has become more and more appreciated in recent decades as a premier silversmith of the colonies here in the Northeast American continent. And this object, whatever price was paid by Mr. Bangs to have this given, was then given to the church here in town. And the church in town, of course, was a part of the town government in 1700. And the minister, in the middle of his 40-plus year pastorate, was Samuel Treat, a highly regarded pastor of Eastham. And the longest
Also in my family tree. Excuse me.
Okay. And so he was the one who would have used this, which says, those who say the Pilgrims didn't have communion services, well, they had the beautiful chalice to have communion services, at least. We do know that. Part of the Bangs story is that this doesn't end in this at 1700, but in fact, what happened is that somehow or other, a descendant in 1937, and I have to look at my paper closely so as not to incriminate the wrong person, but in 1937, a Bangs descendant, Miss Stearns, through the agent Philip Spaulding, and they are careful in the provenance description at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to give those names, because if somebody goes after them and says, how did you get this sacred object from a church, they want to say, well, Philip Spaulding and Miss Stearns owned it and sold it to us for, in this case, $3,000 in 1937. The big mystery is, how is it that a Bangs descendant got it back from the church, from the town who owned it? In any event, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston purchased it from these folks for $3,000, accession date November 17th, 1937. And then, decades later, they decided not to have it on display at the Museum of Fine Arts, but to loan it permanently, or fairly permanently, to Yale Gallery of Art, where you can see it. And one of the reasons why it would be in Yale is that Yale has sort of the collection of Drummer silver, all in one huge cabinet in their early American art collection. So, as Debbie and I were speaking before this segment, we might have to hire the right lawyer, but we would love to get the chalice back. And maybe they might loan it back to us for an exhibition sometime. So thanks for listening to the Bangs family story. A dead widow, a lovely chalice.
Lost to Eastham.
And women's names being lost.
Right.
So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
In closing, I would like to thank you for watching this episode of the Campfire series. If you're interested in purchasing the 7 Nauset settlers family trees and are joining the Eastham Historical Society, please contact us at easthamhistoricalsociety.org.